Welcome back to the Chess Geek channel. I'm super excited to present 1b3, known as the Nimzo-Larsen Opening, sometimes also called just Larsen Opening, and sometimes also called the Queenside Fianchetto Opening. In this video, we're going to completely break down all of the important theory that you need to know about this opening. We're going to look at e5, which is known as the modern variation. We're going to look at the classical variation with d5. We're also going to look at a game example to really cement in the middle game and endgame plans of this opening. And before all that, we are going to talk about the basic strategy and basic things you should know when playing this opening. Now, this opening has been utilized by the top players in the world. Carlsen, Nakamura, Caruana, everyone has played this. And what I've found is it's not just 1 or 2 or 3 games in their 1,000-game-long careers. They've played this dozens upon dozens of times, and clearly through their consistency, it is actually a very viable weapon. Now, the whole point and strategy behind the move b3 is to play a hyper-modern system. Of course, we're giving black the ability to take full control of the center with e5 and d5. And we're not going to contest that immediately with the common 1d4 or 1e4 moves. Instead, we are going to play bishop b2, and with our knights, our bishops, and ultimately later in the game also our pawns, we are going to take back control of the center. Now, typically, we're not going to play d3 in this sort of setup and go for an e4 strike in the center, because that leaves our pawn structure very weakened. All of the dark squares become weak, and even though we have a dark square bishop here, why should we unnecessarily weaken our dark squares? Similarly, we're not going to go c3 because that doesn't make too much sense either. We're blocking in our bishop. And so instead, we're going to typically go e3, and this pawn will support our break in the center with d4. Now, if you've followed along in the channel, you've noticed that I made a lot of videos on the English defense, which is incredibly similar to this opening here. And the English defense is really against d4 or e4, where we start by playing e6 or b6, but ultimately we put both pawns on e6 and b6. We fianchetto the bishop and play in this sort of structure, an exact same strategy with the black pieces. Now, I've talked about the theory of this opening a ton on a variety of videos on this channel, and to summarize it, we're basically eventually going to strike with f5, d5, or c5 to take and reclaim back control in the center. And so with the white pieces, we're going for a very similar structure. We're playing b3, and then we're ultimately playing e3. We'll typically first develop the bishop, but ultimately we are going for a e3 and b3 setup. And just like in the e6 and b6 setup, we're going to strike with c4 and d4. Although f4 is a little less likely here. And the reason for this is, of course, this is an improved version of this defense, which is already good because we're up a tempo. And so we don't have to resort to weakening moves like f4 to take control of the center. We can strike more directly because of the extra tempo that we have. And so basically, we're transposing into the e6, b6 setup, and we're utilizing it with the white pieces with extra tempo. And it's a whole lot of fun and clearly a very consistent weapon at the top level. So let's begin by talking about the modern system with e5. Now we play bishop to b2, they're going to develop their knight to c6, and we continue with e3. Here, notice we already have a lot of pressure on this e5 pawn, so after they develop their knight, we can go bishop b5, and in some cases, take this knight and take the pawn. So the very natural-looking a6 move, trying to trap our bishop in some cases, clearly fails in this position because we win the pawn. And that's the benefit of having a bishop tucked away here. For the entirety of this game, they have to worry about the dark squares in the center, and it's a big hassle for them to constantly be thinking about that. So instead of a6, they're going to play a move like d6 here, controlling the center. Now we continue with knight to e2. Knight to f3 is also sometimes fine, but here I find that they can pin the knight, they can attack the knight with tempo. The knight is a bit more vulnerable here on f3, and I prefer it to be on e2, where it can serve the exact same purpose on f3, which is to prepare the move d4, which is our main striking idea in the center. So they'll continue with bishop e7. We can castle or play d4 immediately, but let's throw in castles, and ultimately d4. Now, you might be a bit surprised here. Aren't we kind of blocking in this bishop? But I'll talk about why this is actually not the case momentarily. Let's look at the two main options they have. They can take or they can push and try to close the center. If they take, this tends to work perfectly well for us. We can take back. In some cases, you can consider, there's some games where players decided to take here first and then take back and go for the weakness on this square, and if they push, you could even try to continue with the knight. That's one style. I prefer to just trade in the center and keep my bishop, because as you will see, the bishop doesn't have a purpose here, but now that the center has opened up, it very much has a purpose on the d3 square. And all of our bishops, both of them, are super active compared to their counterparts. Our queen is good, and it cannot really be kicked away. c5 is a bit of a weakening move. You look at this d6 pawn, and it becomes a bit weak. And ultimately, we're looking to develop our knight to either d2 or c3. c3 does block in the bishop a little, and from d2, it has a ton of possibilities. It can go to f3, it can go to e4, it can go to c4. The rooks will centralize on the d1 and e1 square, and we can strike with e4 followed by e5 and just gain a ton of pressure in the center. We have totally reclaimed the center, and we are doing very well. So going back, a lot of times black, especially at the lower levels, will play e4 because they see this bad bishop and they want to play d5 next and think that they're totally shutting in this bishop. But what you will see is in practicality that's not as simple or effective as it seems. We can first deal with this knight, which we can reroute, for example, to g3. Let's say they develop their bishop. We can move our queen to d2. They can play d5, their main structure, and I'm going to show you how we tear apart this structure. So first we can get rid of this bishop, force it into a more passive state. Then we can continue with c4, and this is our main idea. It's almost like a French or Caro-Kann structure, but again, all of these transpositions to structures you might be familiar with, like the French or Caro-Kann structures, are going to be better for us because we're up a tempo. So here we're going to treat this just like those structures. We're going to strike with c4 and f3, just like in the French and Caro-Kann, where you strike with c5 and f6. And because of these two pawn moves, we're going to chip away at their center. Ultimately, we're going to disturb their center and eventually free up the pawn structure and be able to open up our bishop. And they can't really do much about it. One potential move they can try after c4 is the move a6, and their plan is to take, and then they have a ton of backup support in the center. So we don't do this. Instead, we actually begin by throwing in this move to force them to do something in the center, and after, let's say, knight takes on d5, now we can either retreat the bishop, but here it's best to just take. And in the end, they already don't have their pawn structure, so we managed to ruin their center pawn structure, so this pawn is weak, but also these two pawns are incredibly weakened and really hard to defend. So we clearly have really good play, and white is doing beautifully well. So going back, they don't have to play this, of course, but otherwise we're prepared to take as well, and even if they don't play a6, we can still go into that same variation where we're targeting some key weaknesses in the position. And other than that, it's very hard to defend this, especially with the knight on c6. They cannot play c6 themselves and defend the pawn. So black has not prepared to play a French or Caro-Kann structure, so they haven't optimized their position, like being able to play c6 or in some cases even being able to play f5. They don't have those pawn moves available because they never prepared to get into these sort of positions. So we're throwing them off of their preparations, and we're leaving ourselves in very comfortable territory where we're up a tempo. So that really sums up the modern variation after e5. now we can look at the move d5. And this move is known as the classical, and we continue in a very similar structure. Now, black is going for perhaps a more queenside centralized control with c5 and d5, but that's not a problem whatsoever. We continue by developing. As always, we get our e3, b3 setup, striking still with d4. They develop their bishop, we go d4, bishop d3, and the only way that black can ever put pressure, I mean, if they go c6, this is so passive, and we're really happy to strike with c4. Otherwise, they have to put pressure with c5, but of course, this tension is always good for us, because some of you might still be worried about your bishop, but what you have to understand is the bishop doesn't have to be open for it to be good, and especially when there's this tension here, which black is basically forced into playing in order for them to get center control. When there's this tension here, this bishop will inevitably open up. If we transpose into an endgame where we want the bishop to have a bigger scope, we can choose to take then. Or if we transpose into a very crushing attack, as you will see, where we play e4 and then e5, or we take and then get our rook involved and our knight involved, and we want our bishop as well, then we can take in that position. So we always have the chance to open up the bishop at the perfect moment for us, and they can't do much about it. And of course, if they take, we don't have to take with the pawn, although that's also a totally viable setup, and then go for c4 and try to open up the bishop like this. We can also just take with the knight or the bishop directly, and the bishop, of course, has a full diagonal. So the point with this explanation is the bishop doesn't always have to have this visually enticing diagonal. It can always open up, and you know, this is definitely not a permanent situation. The bishop always has incredible potential. So we can castle, they develop their knight, we develop our knight, and the reason we go to d2 is because, of course, we want to strike with c4 ultimately. Now, one nice positional concept that the engine really enjoys is to play a3 in these sort of positions to really stop the knight from harassing our clearly good bishop here. Another point is, because the pawn is on b3, our first move in the game, they never can play c4 and then really shut in this bishop, because that's just an inaccessible square for them. So we have really good control on the queen side and good potential to attack on the king side as well. So, for example, bishop e7, rook c1, and the ideas are plentiful here. We have the critical idea of going for c4 in this sort of position to open up the queen side further and, you know, expose their position. We obviously have really good development here. We also have a totally legitimate idea to attack on the king side and really use this bishop in a more aggressive and ambitious manner. We can go rook e1 and then push e4. Now, typically we want to go e5, but that's when the bishop is here, so it already has a scope. e5 would truly shut in the bishop, so I find that after e4, the best option is to take. True, it's leaving the center open, but we still have great potential to then attack, and because of this tension, our bishop gets open, and so ultimately we're going to have one bishop open, two bishops open, a knight that can come in, a rook that can come in, a queen that will swing in, and this knight, because it's on d2 especially, can swing in also to f3 to support, or to g6 and then f5, and the ideas are just, you know, coming through really quickly. So we have a beautiful way to play here. We can play positionally on the queen side or aggressively on the king side. Super flexible position. We're really happy. So going back, that is the theory-based section of this opening video. You don't actually have to memorize the moves per se, as long as you solidify the concepts, right? So we're going for e3 and d4. We're typically placing the knight on d2, placing the bishop either on b5 or d3. We're castling, we're getting our rooks to the c, e, or in some cases d file if the d file opens up, and then we're trying to expand our center control. If you get that concept, then you're going to have a beautiful time in this opening. Now, right before we look at a game example, I want to show you what happens if they're a little too ambitious and they play, instead of knight f6, they play knight c6 and they go for e5. They try to take full control. Well, this works well for us, as I mentioned in the beginning. This works well for us in the b6, e6 setup where they go for full control. As black, this works well. So as white, with an extra tempo, this works super well. And we play this just like we would e6, b6. We play bishop b5, and they have tons of issues here on this diagonal. We're threatening to win the pawn immediately because of the pin. In some cases, now f4 becomes more enticing. For example, bishop d6, often f4 becomes an idea to expose the pawn here. I'm not going to cover this because, frankly, I've covered this exact position super in depth twice already on this channel. And so if you want the theory of this position, if they go fully aggressive, I'll leave all of the videos I made on the English or e6, b6 defense in the description. And so if you watch those videos, I think it will also truly benefit you in this opening because, as I mentioned, the ideas are interchangeable between the opening. I mean, they're exactly the same. So it's fun if you already know that theory, if you've already watched those videos, you'll be able to play this with ease. Finally, we are going to look at a game example, and we're going to look at this game that is Carlsen with the white pieces playing against Gustanov. This was from 2017, and let's go ahead and see how Carlsen played this. So we see the expansion with the e3, b3 setup and going for d4. Black decided to counter this with their own fianchetto, and white expanded. Magnus, of course, is a very aggressive player. You can see him expanding on both sides. The a4 move is a defensive one to stop the move a4 from black to open up the position. And of course, h4 is an aggressive one with the idea of perhaps expanding later with the pawn structure over here. Now, black sacrificed some pawns in this position early on to try to open up the position, but what you'll notice is because we have the extra tempo and the really solid pawn structure, they can't do anything. Our pieces are totally well equipped to defend any attack on the A or B file, and in the meantime, their pieces are actually not developed. All of our pieces are much more active. So here, they were encouraged to go knight b8 to defend this knight here, and it's just a terrible position. Queen d6 put so much pressure. And here after rook to a7, trying to guard a little along the 7th rank, Carlsen transposed into an endgame, of course, up 2 pawns and decided to go for the winning endgame. And this endgame was super easy to win, up 2 pawns on the queen side. It was a piece of cake for Carlsen. Of course, converting this takes time, but it's just busy work. It's not hard whatsoever, and eventually black resigned in this position. So, super simple game. All that white did was play this opening, control both sides, right? h4 and a4, that's a big takeaway in the middle game. You want to take good control with your pawns, right? So this combination of a4 and h4 made it very difficult for black to defend the attack over here and to formulate any sort of attack here. And black, as you saw, resorted to sacrificial means to get the attack going, which clearly just did not pay off whatsoever. So a really instructive game example. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and learned how to totally crush with this opening. Subscribe for more content like this. Like this video if you enjoyed it and learned something new from it. Check out my chess website where you can see all the projects that I'm working on, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.